The wind carried the faint scent of sage across the barren horizon, whispering through the tall grass like a secret that refused to be spoken aloud. Red Hollow lay at the edge of nowhere, a town carved out of dust and survival, where every heart carried scars the eye could not see. Among the wooden storefronts, the weathered saloons, and the endless stretch of earth that shimmered gold beneath the sun, lived two souls who had forgotten what it meant to feel whole. Their lives moved like parallel lines, never quite touching, yet already bound by a fate neither could escape. Lillian Grace stood at the cracked window of the one-room schoolhouse, her fingers grazing the worn leather of her late husband's Bible, her eyes drifting to the streets outside as children hurried past. She had come here seeking peace, but peace had eluded her. Loneliness clung to her like a second skin, an ache that not even prayer could ease. In her heart, grief had carved a hollow space where joy once lived, leaving only memories that pressed against her ribs like unhealed bruises. Yet, beneath the layers of mourning, a quiet strength glimmered, fragile but persistent, like the faint glow of a lantern that refuses to go out in the storm. Beyond the schoolhouse walls, Silas Wade moved through the town like a shadow. A towering figure, scarred by war, known more by rumor than truth. Men nodded with wary respect when he passed. Women lowered their gazes, whispering about his solitude, about the storm-grey eyes that seemed to hold too much pain. He had built walls so high around his heart that even the sunlight struggled to reach him. But fate has a way of drawing broken souls together, healing in the places where the world has wounded them most deeply. The morning sun painted Red Hollow in hues of amber, softening its rough edges, and for a fleeting moment even this hard land seemed tender. Lillian traced the horizon, her thoughts drifting, when her gaze lingered on the distant figure of a man astride a horse at the ridge. He did not move, and yet his stillness carried more weight than motion. Even from far away she felt it, the pull of something unnamed, something that made her chest tighten with both fear and a trembling hope she had not allowed herself in years. She told herself it was nothing, only a rider passing by, yet her heart knew better. It recognized the start of a story not yet written. Sometimes love begins not with words, but with the quiet recognition of another's sorrow. Sometimes it is born in silence, in the space between two souls who have forgotten how to dream, and sometimes it arrives like a slow dawn, spreading warmth where night once lingered too long. In that fragile space between past and future, between loss and possibility, Lillian Grace and Silas Wade were about to collide, not gently, but with the force of lives that had endured too much to pretend any longer. The dusty streets of Red Hollow would soon echo with more than the shuffle of boots and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. They would hold whispers of healing, the fierce rhythm of hearts daring to beat again, and the slow unfolding of a love that neither time nor sorrow could silence. Stay close, listen gently, and if this story awakens something warm inside you, let your heart respond. Leave a thought, share your presence, and walk with me through every chapter ahead. Your quiet support, your unseen hand reaching back, is what allows these words to keep flowing. Like a healing prayer carried on the wind, your likes, your comments, your subscription are not mere gestures. They are part of the light that keeps stories like this alive. And so, as the sun slipped higher over the endless plains, and the shadows drew back to reveal the small town fighting to survive, two lives, worn and wounded, began to move toward each other. What waited ahead was danger, whispers of betrayal, the raw edge of survival, but also the promise of something softer, something worth protecting, perhaps even love itself. And with that promise glimmering just beyond reach, the tale unfolds, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat, drawing them closer to the moment that would change everything. The morning settled over Red Hollow with the slow grace of a hymn, sunlight spilling across rooftops, dust lifting like a veil as shopkeepers pushed open their doors. The town was alive with the rhythm of survival, boots striking wood, wagon wheels crunching gravel, voices rising in barter and gossip. Yet for Lillian Grace, each day began not with bustle, but with the tender ritual of opening her classroom, sweeping the floor, arranging books that smelled faintly of ink and hope, and watching for the first set of eager eyes to appear at the door. Teaching had become her healing, a balm against the ache that never truly left her. Her children came in waves, Billy Harmon with his patched trousers and wide grin, Sarah Cartwright in lace-trimmed sleeves, too fine for a frontier desk, quiet Emma carrying the weight of her broken family like a child twice her age. Each one carried stories of hunger and loss, yet each also carried sparks, small flames waiting for someone to notice. Lillian gave herself to those sparks, pouring into them the knowledge she hoped would guide them further than Red Hollow's narrow streets. Her heart softened as she watched them struggle over arithmetic, smile at verses, and trace letters that seemed like magic on their slates. In their bright eyes, she found pieces of her own healing, as though teaching them was teaching herself to live again. And yet, as the days stretched one into the other, the undercurrent of loneliness followed her like a shadow. At night, when silence pressed too heavily against the thin walls of her cabin, she would open her late husband's Bible, letting her fingers linger on passages that spoke of comfort, strength, and endurance. She prayed not for miracles, but for quiet. Quiet inside her heart. Quiet against the grief that sometimes rose like a tide and threatened to drown her. Still, the ache softened when she recalled the figure on the ridge, the silent rider whose gaze had felt like both a question and an answer. She did not admit it aloud, but she found herself searching the horizon each evening, wondering if he would appear again, tall and still against the dying sun. Silas Wade, though absent from her days, lived in the edges of her thoughts. He was a man defined by distance, his presence in town fleeting, his silence carrying weight that lingered long after he passed. Children whispered stories of him with both awe and fear, how he could track across bare stone, how he once carried an injured horse for miles, how his temper was deadly when provoked. But Lillian had glimpsed something beyond the legends in those rare moments when his eyes caught hers. Pain, yes, and scars, but also a gentleness buried so deep it seemed afraid to surface. It stirred something inside her, a fragile sense that perhaps the most broken souls were the ones most capable of tenderness when given a chance. The town, however, was less forgiving. Red Hollow measured people not by their kindness, but by their usefulness, and for a woman like Lillian, educated, widowed, unwilling to bend fully to its customs, suspicion clung to her like burrs in cloth. She heard it in whispers when she walked by, in the polite but cold nods at church, in the sharp tone of mothers who thought books and ideas would lead their children astray. And though she held her chin high, the sting of rejection cut deeper than she let on. The land was harsh, but people's judgment harsher still. One late afternoon, as the children's voices faded and the schoolhouse emptied, Lillian lingered longer than usual. The golden light poured through the windows, soft and healing, bathing her desk in warmth. She gathered her books slowly, as if reluctant to step back into her solitude. When she finally locked the door and began the walk home, the valley stretched before her in wide silence, broken only by the distant song of a meadowlark. She paused at the ridge above her cabin, Bible pressed against her chest, and there, like an answer to an unspoken prayer, she saw him again. Silas Wade sat astride his horse at the crest of the hill, as motionless as carved stone, the dying sun painting him in fire and shadow. He did not move, did not speak, yet she felt the weight of his gaze fall upon her with a force that set her pulse racing. Fear tangled with something else, something warm, something healing, that made her breath catch. For a long heartbeat, it was only them, the silent schoolteacher and the haunted rancher, suspended in a moment neither understood. Then, with quiet grace, he tipped the brim of his hat, turned his horse, and melted into the gathering dusk. Lillian stood long after he disappeared, her hands trembling, her breath uneven. Something was shifting, unseen but certain, like a seed stirring beneath soil long thought barren. And though shadows crept across the land, she felt, for the first time since she arrived, that perhaps her heart was not condemned to silence forever. The night whispered promises she could not yet name, carrying her forward into the days when fate would no longer let their paths remain apart. The days that followed unfolded with deceptive calm, as if Red Hollow itself were holding its breath. The schoolhouse rang with the chatter of children, their laughter weaving through the walls like fragile threads of light in a place that too often felt heavy with suspicion. Lillian guided them through their lessons, her voice steady, her heart determined, but beneath the routine she felt the faint stirrings of unease. It began with glances, the way townsfolk paused mid-conversation when she walked past, the way words fell into silence as though she had intruded on something meant to remain hidden. She told herself she was imagining it, but the unease lingered like the chill of a shadow she could not step out of. One morning, tucked between the worn pages of her arithmetic primer, she discovered a slip of paper. The words scrawled there were crooked, the ink uneven, but the message was unmistakable. Teachers who don't know their place don't last long in Red Hollow. Stop filling our children's heads with fancy ideas. Leave town or learn what happens to women who forget where they belong. The letters seemed to burn in her hands, cruel strokes cut into paper that felt heavier than it should. She read them again and again, though the meaning was already etched deep, each line coiling through her chest like smoke. Her first instinct was fear, sharp and cold, but as the fear settled, something steadier rose in its place. Anger, not loud, not reckless, but a quiet fire that burned steady and low. She thought of the children, of Billy's grin, of Emma's shy eyes, of Sarah's careful handwriting, of all the fragile hopes that lived inside that one-room schoolhouse. They deserved more than silence. They deserved dreams, lessons, futures. And she would not allow faceless words, penned in cowardice, to drive her from the work that gave her life meaning. Still, the weight of the letter followed her like an echo. The next time she walked through town, she felt eyes trailing her, curiosity sharpened into judgment. Martha Williams from the general store stopped her with words sharpened like knives disguised as concern. "You make those children think they're too good for the lives their parents have built," she said. "You fill their heads with places and stories that will only make them ashamed of where they come from." Lillian's cheeks flushed, her pulse rising, but she answered softly, choosing dignity over defense. Yet the wound remained. Even kindness seemed rationed in Red Hollow, and the line between acceptance and rejection was as thin as breath. It was in that state, fear pressed into her pocket, defiance simmering in her chest, that she met him again, not as a shadow on a ridge, but as a man stepping into her path. And the evening sun painted the road in gold as she made her way home, thoughts heavy, Bible clutched tight. From the direction of her cabin came the sound of hoofbeats, deliberate and steady, until Silas Wade appeared. He sat tall in his saddle, broad shoulders outlined against the horizon, his storm-grey eyes carrying the weight of someone who had known too much violence and too much silence. He stopped a few paces from her, lifted his hat with the courtesy of a gentleman, and spoke her name for the first time. "Miss Grace." His voice was low, rough as gravel smoothed by time, and yet beneath it lived a gentleness that startled her. It was as if thunder had chosen, just once, to soften into rain. He studied her face as though he could read the truth of her troubles without her speaking them aloud. And when he said, "You look troubled this evening. I hope nothing's wrong," she felt something inside her tremble, not with fear, but with the unbearable relief of being seen. She wanted to tell him she was fine, to hold her composure as she always did, but her lips betrayed her, quivering under the weight of the day. "It has been difficult," she admitted softly, and in that moment the wall she had held so tightly began to crack. Silas nodded, his gaze steady, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who understood too well what it meant to be an outsider. "This country is hard on those who don't fit the mold others expect them to fill." The words struck her with such precision she nearly gasped. It was as if he had reached into her chest and named the wound she had been carrying since the moment she arrived. In his storm-grey eyes she saw recognition, not judgment. He knew loneliness. He knew exile. He knew the pain of belonging nowhere. Before she could answer, the sound of more hoofbeats broke the fragile calm. 3 riders emerged from the dust, their faces sharp with menace, their hands too familiar with the weapons they carried. Silas shifted instantly, his body still but coiled like a predator. His hand brushed the butt of his revolver, and his horse pawed the ground as if echoing his tension. He moved just enough to place himself between Lillian and the strangers. "Get behind me," he murmured, steel threaded through every syllable. Lillian obeyed, her heart racing as the riders drew near. The leader's sneer made the air colder. "So, this is the famous Silas Wade," he mocked. "Didn't think I'd find you playing guardian to a schoolteacher." The insult slid over her, but the implications struck deep. They had come for Silas, yes, but by standing at his side, she had become part of the story. And in that moment, as the dust swirled around them and the sun bled into the horizon, Lillian Grace understood. Her life had shifted forever. The fear should have broken her. Instead, it bound her closer to the man standing between her and danger, the man whose very presence steadied her trembling hands. She did not yet know what tomorrow would bring, only that she could no longer imagine her path without his shadow falling across it. The dusk deepened, the standoff began, and with it the first threads of a bond woven not of safety but of trust, not of comfort but of fire. And in that fire, something long dormant within her heart began to heal, even as the night prepared to test them both. The air was sharp with tension, carrying the dry taste of dust and the bitter scent of horse sweat as the three strangers drew their circle tighter. Lillian clutched her Bible against her chest, the weight of it both anchor and shield, her pulse quickening in her throat until it felt louder than the creak of saddle leather. Silas stood before her, tall and unyielding, a fortress carved from scars and silence. She had seen him from afar, imagined his strength in the stories whispered about him, but nothing compared to witnessing the raw authority of his presence as he faced men who lived by violence. His storm-grey eyes did not waver. They measured the danger with calm precision, as though he had known this moment long before it arrived. The leader, Johnson, leaned forward in his saddle, his scraggly beard hiding a smile too cruel to be mistaken for anything but hunger. "You've got debts, Wade," he spat. "Old ones. You thought you could bury them here in this forgotten hole, but ghosts don't stay buried. And now you've given me something sweeter than revenge, something to take from you." His eyes flicked to Lillian, and she felt a chill burrow through her skin, sharper than any wind the plains had ever carried. Silas's voice cut the dusk like a blade, low and steady, every word shaped with deadly calm. "The lady has nothing to do with this." He shifted his weight slightly, blocking her further with his horse's massive frame, and in that movement she understood that he had already chosen his position, not beside her, not near her, but in front of her, between her and every bullet, every cruel hand. "Nothing to do with it?" Johnson laughed, the sound raw, echoing through the twilight. "When a man looks at a woman the way you've been looking at her, Wade, she has everything to do with it. That's the price of caring. Makes you weak, makes you vulnerable." But there was no weakness in Silas, only that terrifying stillness, the calm of a storm that had not yet broken. He let the silence stretch, let the men's confidence waver, as though they too began to wonder if they had misjudged what stood before them. Then his words came, cold as iron. "You're counting wrong, Johnson. There's only one of me, and only one of you that matters. When you fall, the rest will scatter." Even Lillian, pressed close behind him, felt the truth in those words. He wasn't bluffing. He was simply stating the reality of a man who had lived too long with death at his side. Her heart hammered not just from fear, but from the unbearable weight of what it meant. This scarred, solitary man was willing to fight, even to die, for her. The thought shook her, healing and breaking her in the same breath. For 2 years she had been unseen, drifting through her grief like a ghost in her own life. But in Silas Wade's stance, in the way he faced danger with her hidden behind him, she felt seen, fully, fiercely, painfully alive. Johnson sneered, but something flickered in his eyes. Doubt, that first small crack in bravado. He spat into the dirt, jerking his reins sharply. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." "It is for tonight," Silas replied, his voice steady, quiet thunder rolling across the valley. He did not move until the men finally wheeled their horses away, their departure swallowed by the darkening horizon, their threat lingering like smoke. Only when the hoofbeats faded did Lillian realize she had been holding her breath. It left her in a shudder that seemed to carry months of loneliness with it, leaving her trembling and unsteady. Silas turned, his gaze softening as it fell on her. "Are you hurt?" His voice, moments ago a weapon, was now a balm, deep, low, laced with concern so genuine it nearly undid her. She shook her head, unable to trust her voice. He swung down from the saddle with effortless grace, closing the space between them. Even standing on the ground, he seemed to tower, his presence both overwhelming and strangely healing. The scar along his jaw caught the last light of the day, and for the first time she did not see it as a mark of violence, but as proof of survival. Proof that this man, though hardened, still carried something tender enough to shield her. "You should know," he said quietly, his hand brushing the brim of his hat. "Those men will come back. When they do, they won't care about fair fights. They'll strike at what they believe can hurt me most." He paused, his storm-grey eyes searching hers with a vulnerability that startled her. "They think that's you." Her breath caught, the truth of it unfolding like a revelation she had both feared and longed for. "Then, you care." The words slipped out, fragile, trembling. "Haven't you felt me watching over you all these months?" His admission was raw, heavy with meaning, as if each word cost him. "Haven't you known?" She thought of the ridge, of his silhouette against the sky, of the strange comfort that had stirred inside her whenever she felt the weight of his gaze. Tears pricked her eyes, not of grief this time, but of something gentler, something healing. "I thought it was only hope," she whispered. "I didn't dare believe." "I believe," Silas said simply. His hand, calloused yet unexpectedly gentle, rose to her cheek. He touched her as if she were something fragile and precious, something worth protecting with every breath in his body. "I've been carrying this, waiting for the courage to give it to you." From his pocket he drew a small wooden rose, polished smooth, every petal carefully carved. "Made it for you, to remind you that even in this hard country, beauty can grow, that you are worth the effort." The rose lay warm in her palm, and her tears fell freely now. It was not a jewel, not a treasure, but something more enduring, a piece of his soul shaped by his hands. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You are beautiful," he said with such quiet certainty that she believed him. The evening wrapped around them, shadows deepening, the horizon softening into night. For the first time in years, Lillian did not feel alone. She felt the fragile beginnings of something new, healing, tender, unsteady but real. She knew danger waited, that shadows would return, that the road ahead was jagged with threat and trial. But she also knew, as she looked into Silas Wade's scarred face and storm-grey eyes, that she had found someone who would stand before her, between her and every darkness. Someone who had already claimed her heart without needing permission. And as he offered his arm with a rough gentleness that felt like the promise of safety, she placed her hand upon it, stepping with him into the night. The path ahead was uncertain, yet for the first time since her world had shattered, her heart beat not with dread, but with quiet, healing hope. Together, they walked toward the cabin lights, glowing faintly in the valley, unaware that the storm gathering around them was only just beginning. The morning after their quiet walk together, The valley seemed to breathe differently, as though the land itself sensed the shift between them. Lillian woke to the sound of birdsong floating through her open window, the crisp air carrying a sweetness that made her linger in bed longer than usual. On her small table lay the wooden rose, its polished surface catching the soft glow of dawn. She lifted it into her hands, and the fragile carving felt heavier than stone, not in weight, but in meaning. No man had ever given her something so humble, yet so profound. It was not a trinket. It was time, thought, a piece of himself. In the silence of her cabin, she pressed it to her chest and felt something in her heart loosen, as if old wounds were finally allowed to breathe. When she stepped into town later, her shoulders squared and her chin lifted, she noticed the change immediately. Conversations stilled when she passed. Eyes followed her longer than before, their curiosity sharpened into something colder. Whispers trailed after her like burrs clinging to fabric. What had once been polite distance was now edged with hostility. She told herself it did not matter, that their judgment could not touch her, but the truth pressed heavy against her ribs. It hurt, not because she sought their approval, but because she longed for a place to belong, and Red Hollow still seemed determined to push her to the margins. That afternoon, while the children worked quietly on their lessons, she found another note waiting among her books. The handwriting was rough, the message unmistakable. Leave before it's too late. You don't belong here. Her fingers trembled as she folded the letter away, but she refused to let the children see fear in her eyes. They looked to her for guidance, for hope, and she would not let shadows claim the light of their classroom. Yet the words dug deep, and she carried them like stones in her pocket, heavy and unrelenting. Evening fell with the hush of an old hymn. The horizon burned with streaks of crimson and violet, the air thick with the smell of dust and distant rain. Lillian walked home slower than usual, her mind circling the threats, the isolation, the gnawing ache of not knowing who wished her harm. At the edge of her valley, her steps faltered. Silas was there again, waiting astride his horse, his figure etched against the fading light. This time he did not keep his distance. He rode forward, the ground trembling faintly beneath his horse's stride, until he stopped just a breath away. "Lillian," he said softly, her name carrying a weight she had never heard before, as though speaking it had cost him something. His storm-grey eyes studied her, unyielding yet tender, searching her face with an intensity that left her bare. "You've been troubled." "I can see it." The truth threatened to spill, and she pressed her lips together to keep them from trembling. But his voice, low, rough, threaded with a gentleness she had not thought him capable of, broke her last defense. "Someone wants me gone," she whispered. "They think I don't belong here. And sometimes I wonder if they're right." Silas leaned closer, his presence vast, filling the air around her until she felt both shielded and undone. "You belong more than most," he said firmly. "This land is cruel, this town harsher still, but you've faced it with your head high. Don't let cowards in the dark decide who you are." His words, quiet as they were, carried the healing warmth of a fire in winter. For a moment, she could not speak, only gaze at him, at the scar that marked his jaw, at the eyes that held storms and silence, but also something steadier, something that looked like devotion. Then the sound of hoofbeats shattered the fragile stillness. 3 riders came fast from the direction of town, raising dust like a rising storm. Silas's body stiffened, the change in him immediate. His hand dropped to the gun at his hip, his entire frame shifting from gentle guardian to warrior forged in war. "Behind me," he said again, and she obeyed, heart pounding. The riders pulled up in a spray of grit. Their leader sneered, his eyes cold with recognition. "Thought you could hide, Wade? Thought the past wouldn't catch up?" His voice dripped with venom, but his gaze slid to Lillian, sharp with cruel interest. "Looks like you've found yourself a reason to care again. That makes her valuable." The words struck Lillian like a lash, but before fear could rise, Silas's voice cut through the dusk, steady as steel. "Touch her, and you won't live to regret it." For a long, suffocating moment, no one moved. The air itself seemed to still, waiting. And then, with a sneer and a spit of dust, the leader tugged his reins, retreating with the others into the growing night. "This isn't finished," he called back, his voice fading into the horizon. Silas remained motionless until the last echo of hoofbeats disappeared. Only then did he exhale, the tension easing from his shoulders. He turned to her, his gaze no longer storm, but something gentler, aching. "They'll come again," he said, "and when they do, they'll bring more. They'll strike at me through you, because they believe you are my weakness." He paused, then spoke the truth she had already felt. "But you're not my weakness, Lillian. You're the one thing that's keeping me strong." Her breath caught, tears burning hot at the edges of her vision. She had been so long unseen, so long convinced her worth was buried with her husband's grave. And yet, here stood a man scarred by war and solitude, claiming her not as a burden, but as a light. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "And what am I to you, Silas Wade?" His hand lifted, calloused fingers brushing her cheek with aching care. "You're the only thing I've wanted in years. You're what I've been waiting to find in all this emptiness." The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the hush of twilight, their hearts reaching across the silence. And though danger lingered at the edges of the night, Lillian felt, for the first time since grief had hollowed her, that she was not alone. Something fragile and healing was blooming between them, delicate as a rose carved by hand, yet strong enough to withstand the storms yet to come. The sky deepened, the stars stirring awake one by one, and as they began the walk toward her cabin, her hand resting lightly in the crook of his arm, the night no longer felt so heavy. It carried the faint promise of warmth, of courage, of love, still in its first fragile steps, love that would be tested, but not easily broken. And as the shadows drew closer, she realized her heart had already chosen its place to stand. The days that followed passed in a haze of watchfulness, every hour stretched taut with the memory of that confrontation on the dusty road. Lillian went about her lessons with steady grace, her voice warm as she guided the children through recitations. But beneath the surface her heart thudded with the knowledge that shadows were moving closer. She could feel it in the way conversations hushed when she entered the mercantile, in the way certain townsfolk turned their backs with practiced indifference, and in the way her students, perceptive beyond their years, studied her face as though they sensed the weight she carried. She told herself she had chosen this life, that she would not run, but in the quiet hours she admitted her fear, not only for herself, but for the man who had stepped between her and danger as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Silas came often now, no longer a distant silhouette on the ridges, but a steady presence that filled the lonely edges of her days. He brought bread, firewood, small tokens of care that spoke louder than any declarations could. Sometimes he said little, content to sit at her small table with a cup of coffee cradled in his scarred hands, the silence between them softer than any words. Other times he surprised her with stories, fragments of a past soaked in blood and loss, but also threaded with unexpected tenderness. He told her of the horse he had once carried 3 miles to save, of a child in a burned-out farmhouse whose hand he had held until she drifted into peace, of comrades whose laughter still haunted him when the nights grew long. Each confession unfolded like a piece of a map, leading her closer to the truth of him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the valley in gold and crimson, she found herself on the porch of her cabin, Silas standing close enough that she could feel the quiet radiance of his presence. The air was cool, touched with sage, and the promise of rain. Her hand rested unconsciously on the wooden rose he had given her, and in that moment she dared to ask, "Why me, Silas? Of all the people you could choose to notice, why me?" He was silent for a long time, his eyes on the horizon where the last light bled away. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, threaded with a rawness that stilled her breath. "Because you carry your pain with dignity. Because you look at this hard country and still find beauty in it. Because you're brave enough to stand alone and kind enough to still care for others, even when the world has given you every reason not to. I've been a soldier, a killer, a man half dead to feeling. But when I see you, Lillian Grace, I remember I still have a heart, and I can't let you face this world alone." Her throat tightened, her eyes burning with tears she did not try to hide. She reached for his hand, rough and strong, and held it as though anchoring herself to something solid after years adrift. The warmth of his skin, the simple strength of his grip, carried a healing she had not known she needed. For the first time since Thomas's death, she allowed herself to imagine a tomorrow that did not feel empty. Yet the world refused to grant them peace. That very night, a stone shattered the small window of her cabin, a crude note tied to it with twine, "Leave now or pay the price." The words were jagged, written by a hand that knew only malice. Silas picked up the stone, jaw tight, his storm-grey eyes flashing with a fury she had never seen so close. "They mean to break you," he said, voice low and dangerous. "But they'll have to come through me first." The next days sharpened into vigilance. Silas began staying near the cabin after dark, sometimes sleeping in the lean-to beside the corral, sometimes walking the ridges with his rifle slung across his back, a sentinel carved into the landscape. Lillian tried to protest, but the truth was that his presence steadied her. She found herself listening for the rhythm of his footsteps outside, for the creak of the porch boards when he paused to check the night, for the low whistle he gave when the wind rose too fiercely. The sounds of his watch became a lullaby of safety, a reminder that she was no longer facing the darkness alone. One morning she prepared breakfast, coffee, biscuits, a jar of honey she had saved for special occasions, and invited him inside. He ducked beneath the low doorway, filling her small cabin with his vast presence, yet moving with surprising gentleness. They ate in companionable quiet, until her eyes lingered on the scar that carved down his temple to his jaw. She had seen it before, but now, with sunlight spilling across his face, she felt the question rise unbidden. "Does it hurt you still?" she asked softly. He touched the scar absent-mindedly, then shook his head. Not the flesh, but the memory. It was a saber during Antietam. I was helping a wounded friend, and the boy who struck me was younger than I was. I killed him seconds later. I live with that more than I live with the scar. His voice did not falter, but the quiet weight of the admission pressed into the air. Lillian reached across the table and laid her hand over his. "We all carry ghosts," she whispered. "What matters is what we build with what remains." The words left her without thought, born of instinct, and she realized they were as much for herself as for him. He looked at her then, and in his gaze she saw not just pain, but gratitude, as though her presence offered a healing balm to wounds that had never known rest. Later that afternoon, Silas saddled a mare gentle enough for her and invited her to ride with him. She hesitated only a moment before accepting, and together they moved beyond the familiar valley into rolling hills gilded by wild flowers. He led her to a hidden meadow, a place he confessed had been his refuge since childhood. A stream whispered through the grass, cottonwoods stood sentinel at the edges, and the air was alive with the hum of bees. "Here," he said softly, "the world feels quiet enough to remember who we are." They dismounted, and she trailed her fingers through the cold stream, marveling at the way the light caught in the water like broken glass. Silas sat nearby, watching her with a tenderness that seemed too fragile for a man like him. "This place is yours now, too," he said, and the words struck her like a vow. She looked at him, at the broad shoulders bowed by burdens, at the eyes that held storms and silence, but also the steady glow of something healing. Her voice trembled as she asked, "Is that what I am to you? A place of quiet? A refuge?" Silas's answer was simple, but it carried the weight of his entire soul. "You're worth fighting the world for." The words lingered, soft as prayer, fierce as promise. And when he bent to kiss her, careful, reverent, his lips carrying both fire and restraint, she felt the world shift beneath her feet. The meadow blurred around them, the stream's song faded, and all that remained was the truth between them, a truth long waiting to be spoken aloud. When they pulled apart, breathless, Lillian's hand lingered against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart beneath scars and sinew. For years she had lived as if hers had stopped beating. Now, with Silas's warmth radiating into her, she felt it again, alive, strong, ready. The fear, the threats, the hostility of the town could no longer smother that certainty. Something had begun to bloom, fragile yet unstoppable, healing yet fierce. As the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the meadow, Silas spoke the words that would carry them forward. "They will come for us again, but when they do, we'll face them together. No running, no hiding, just us and what we've found." And though danger gathered on the horizon, Lillian felt no tremor of retreat. She had been broken, yes, but in the breaking she had become strong. She turned her gaze toward him, her voice steady as she answered, "Then let them come." "I'm not afraid any more." The air grew cool, the meadow softened into twilight, and as they rode back toward Red Hollow, hand brushing hand, they carried between them not just the weight of coming battles, but the quiet, unshakable promise of love, healing, fierce, and real. The storm would break soon, but they had already chosen their ground. The church bells rang faintly across Red Hollow that Sunday morning, their sound carried by the wind through streets too quiet, too watchful. Lillian walked with her Bible pressed against her chest, the blue ribbon she had dared to wear in her hair catching the early light like a declaration that she was finished with hiding. Every step into that church felt like stepping into fire, yet she kept her chin high, her spine straight, her heart steady. She had lived too long bowing beneath grief. She would not bow now beneath whispers. Inside, the congregation shifted like restless grain, faces tightening when she entered. Some looked away, others stared with judgment that tried to wound. At the front pew, Mayor Cartwright and his wife Eleanor exchanged sharp glances before rising to greet her with smiles too thin to be sincere. After service, they drew her aside, their voices soft but heavy with the authority of the town. "Miss Grace," Eleanor said, her tone thick with practiced pity, "it is troubling for parents to see their children's teacher keeping company with a man of Mr. Wade's reputation." Lillian's heart tightened, but her voice came out steady. "Silas Wade has been nothing but honorable and kind to me. I will not be ashamed of his respect." The mayor cleared his throat, unease flickering behind his eyes. "The school board is concerned. A woman in your position must be above reproach." For months she had bitten her tongue, absorbed their barbed words in silence, but now something fierce rose inside her. "Perhaps the board should ask itself why it confuses gossip with morality," she answered, surprising even herself with the steel in her voice. "I am more than a symbol to be paraded for propriety. I am a teacher, a widow, a woman who has earned the right to her choices, and I will not apologize for finding companionship in a man who has shown more honor than half this town combined." Eleanor's face hardened, but the murmur of nearby congregants suggested her words had struck deeper than intended. Lillian left them standing in the dust of their disapproval, walking out of the church into the sunlight that felt warmer than any sanctuary had ever been. Yet even as the light kissed her skin, doubt pressed at the edges of her thoughts. She had seen Silas fight like a man forged in violence. She had heard his voice edge into steel when he faced danger. Could she truly believe that the same hands that killed could also cradle love without breaking it? That afternoon, Dr. Hayes visited, his medical bag in hand, his eyes kind. He had always been the one voice of steady compassion in town. As they walked, she asked quietly, "What do you know of Silas Wade's past?" The doctor paused, his expression thoughtful. "I know that he has killed more men than most could count, but I also know he has saved more lives than you'd guess. He is dangerous, yes, but not to you, Lillian. To you, he is a shield. I believe that man would burn the whole territory to keep you safe." His words lingered long after he left, humming in her chest like a psalm she did not yet know by heart. That evening, Silas came to her door. The lamplight caught the exhaustion in his face, the deep furrows carved by years of war and solitude. He stood tall, yet his voice was softer than she had ever heard. "They've been talking about us," he said, his gaze lowered, as though bracing himself for her rejection. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I bring too much trouble." Lillian's breath caught, anger and tenderness mingling in equal measure. "Don't you dare," she whispered, stepping close enough that her hands could rest on his chest. "Don't you dare decide for me." You are not my shame, Silas Wade. You are my strength. If this town cannot see that, then let them look away." His storm-grey eyes lifted to hers, raw with something that looked like both hope and fear. "You could lose everything, your place, your safety, your peace, just by standing with me." "I lost peace the day Thomas died," she answered softly. "I've been drifting ever since. But you make me feel alive again. That is worth more than all their whispers." Something in him broke then, but it was not weakness. It was release. The letting go of years spent carrying a weight too heavy for one man. He drew her into his arms, her cheek pressed against the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and for the first time she allowed herself to rest there, to let the strength of another carry her burdens for a while. It felt like healing, like shelter, like the place she had been searching for since sorrow first claimed her. When she stepped back, she reached for Thomas's compass, the one she had kept as her anchor through widowhood. She placed it gently in Silas's hand. "This always pointed my husband home, and now it points me to you. You are my north, Silas Wade. No matter what storm comes, I will not turn away." His hands trembled as he closed the compass and tucked it into his shirt pocket, directly over his heart. "Then we stand together," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "No matter what comes." Beyond the cabin walls, the night wind rose, carrying with it the faint promise of hoofbeats on the horizon, the echo of danger drawing nearer. But within the circle of his arms, Lillian felt steady, unafraid. The storm could break upon them whenever it chose. She had found her place to stand, and her heart knew it would stand beside him until the end. The storm did not wait long to test the fragile sanctuary they had built. Within days, the valley filled with the sound of riders, their torches burning like scattered stars of malice in the dark. Johnson had returned, not alone, but with men hardened by greed and sharpened by hate. Lillian stood at the window of her cabin, the land deed pressed close to her chest, her breath steady despite the fear clawing at her ribs. Around her, the small home she had built with quiet patience seemed suddenly too fragile, its wooden walls too thin to guard against the violence drawing near. But when she turned and saw Silas Wade strapping on his gun belt with hands steady as stone, the fear shifted into something else: strength, certainty, love shaped into resolve. "Stay close to me," he said, his storm-grey eyes glinting in the lamplight, and though his voice was iron, it carried the warmth of healing, like a prayer whispered into the dark. The first shots cracked the night open like thunder. Glass shattered, wood splintered, the valley echoing with chaos. Fletcher's rifle barked from the back window. Silas's twin Colts spat fire at the front, and Lillian, her hands trembling but steady, took her place by the side window with the small derringer Thomas had once taught her to use. Every heartbeat felt like borrowed time, every breath a fragile gift. Yet within the roar of gunfire she felt no despair. She felt the certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, standing not as a victim, but as a woman claiming her place, her voice, her love. Silas fought like a man carved from the war itself, his movements sure, his aim unerring. But more than the violence, it was his presence that steadied her, the way he glanced back between volleys to meet her eyes, reminding her without words that she was his anchor, his reason to stand unbroken. And when the smoke thickened and the night grew sharp with the scent of powder and blood, it was her voice that whispered steady in the silence between volleys, "I'm here. You're not alone." The fight stretched endless, then snapped into chaos when Silas broke through the cabin wall and circled behind the men, turning predator into prey. Lillian's heart hammered as she glimpsed him through smoke and fire, moving with deadly grace, protecting not only her life but the fragile dream they had dared to hold. Johnson's men faltered, their confidence shattered under the weight of his fury, until finally the valley fell quiet, broken only by groans of the wounded and the crackle of torches smouldering in the dirt. When dawn broke, its light revealed ruin and survival tangled together. The cabin bore scars, shattered wood, scorched earth, broken glass, but within its battered frame stood Silas, alive, his shirt torn and stained, his eyes bright with fierce relief. He crossed the room to her, every step slow, deliberate, as though savoring the miracle that she still stood. "Lillian," he whispered, his voice rough with exhaustion yet threaded with warmth. "You're safe." She stepped into his arms, pressing her face against the steady rise of his chest, her tears soaking into the fabric worn soft by years of labor. For the first time, she wept not from grief, but from release. The release of fear, of loneliness, of the long ache of widowhood. In his embrace, she found the healing she had never dared to ask for, the promise of a love forged in fire but meant for gentleness. Later, when the territorial marshal arrived with Fletcher's papers and the truth spilled like sunlight into every shadow of Red Hollow, the conspiracy crumbled. Mayor Cartwright and his allies were shackled, their corruption laid bare. The town that had once whispered against her now looked upon Lillian Grace with awe, no longer the lonely widow who did not belong, but the woman who had faced down shadows and stood unbroken, who had turned her grief into strength. In the weeks that followed, the land that had nearly destroyed her began to heal. The mine was restored under honest work, the school expanded, the children's laughter grew freer, carrying on the wind like a hymn of resilience. And in the heart of it all stood Lillian and Silas, no longer two broken souls orbiting one another, but a union bound by choice, by fire, by love. He carved her more wooden roses, each one smoother, more intricate than the last, while she tied her blue ribbon in her hair with pride, no longer a symbol of mourning, but of hope reborn. Together they built a home not only of wood and stone, but of trust, laughter and tenderness that healed what the world had once broken. Their wedding came on a morning gilded with sunlight, the church filled with faces that had once turned cold, but now shone with warmth. Silas slipped a plain gold band onto her finger, his scarred hands trembling with reverence. "With this," he whispered, "I promise you not only my strength, but my gentleness for all the days we're given." And when she answered, her voice clear and warm, the church erupted in cheers, carrying their vows into the rafters like a hymn of healing. As they danced that night beneath the open stars, the town alive with celebration, Lillian lifted her face to the sky and felt whole again. Life had broken her once, but in that breaking she had been remade into something stronger, something radiant. And as Silas held her close, whispering promises only for her ears, she knew that sometimes love does not arrive softly. It arrives in fire, in storms, in the fierce healing of two wounded hearts choosing one another. And now, dear listener, if this story stirred something gentle in your soul, if it brought you warmth in a moment when the world felt cold, let your heart answer in return. Leave a thought. Share your voice. Let me know you walked this path with me. Press the like, subscribe, and comment so that together we can keep weaving stories of love, of healing, of courage found in the quietest places. Your presence is the light that keeps these tales alive, and every whisper of support is a seed planted for the next story waiting to bloom. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info.